This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
So I seem to have started, ladies, gentlemen, friends of paleography from near and far, in a year in which the prominence of paleography has risen to such heights that I probably don't need to say that this is a lecture about the history of the book. It is a great pleasure to welcome you all to the University of London annual Paleography Lecture, founded now by the John Coffin Fund. I've been unable, I'm afraid, to say when these lectures were first instituted, but there are people here whom I know. I certainly remember Julian Brown holding lectures as well as his seminars, and I'm reliably informed that Alan Bishop's English Caroline Minuscule was delivered as a set of 3 paleography lectures in the tradition in which we welcome tonight's speaker. So may I thank you, may I recognize representatives of distinguished and humane universities on both sides of the Atlantic and both sides of the Channel. It's a very great pleasure to welcome Professor Mark Smith, a friend and colleague of Dr. Webber from the École des Chartes, with which the Institute of Historical Research has a liaison, an arrangement, an alliance, and it's a very great pleasure to welcome all of you. You're here not to listen to me, you are here to listen to Tessa, but for those of you to whom her work is not yet familiar, she has written the finest account I know in English of how a scriptorium works, her Oxford thesis, Scribes and Scholars at Salisbury Cathedral. She has brought successfully the Cambridge history of libraries in Great Britain to fruition, and those who have been edited by her know quite how exemplary her work was there. She's edited the catalogues of the libraries of Augustinian Canons, like the library in Leicester, and she has paid attention to the paleography and the diplomatic of charter scribes, so she's in the tradition of Leopold de Leedham. And last but not least, she will probably be familiar to everyone in this room as the person who not only brought Albert Derelai's guide to prescriptive Gothic manuscripts to fruition, but also laboured day and night, I think I'm entitled to say, on making that book the indispensable tool that it is. If you have volumes you wish to publish, Dr. Webber is the editor of the Cambridge Studies in Paleography and Codicology. We are always keen on submissions. So, without more ado, may I invite you to join me in welcoming Dr. Webber to give this year's John Coffin University of London lecture in paleography, reading in the Refectory, monastic practice in England from the 11th to the 13th centuries. We welcome you, Mike.
Thank you very much, David, for that very kind introduction. The topic of this lecture was inspired by a talk I heard some years ago given by the late great paleographer Father Leonard Boyle. In it, he drew attention to the presence in a wide variety of medieval books of accents written either by the scribe or supplied subsequently. Here we have an example from an early 12th century copy of Bede's commentary on the Catholic epistles from the Abbey of Peterborough. In the left-hand column, in line 10, an accent has been traced above the word catalogo. Father Boyle pointed out that these simple hairline traces are usually ignored by scholars in their descriptions and discussions of such manuscripts, but he argued that we should take notice of them since they provide precious evidence of the kind of use made of the books in which they are found. The function of the accents was to assist readers in the task of public reading, that is, the oral delivery of a text to an assembled community or group. The accent indicates where the principal stress should fall in words that might pose a difficulty, either because the stress didn't fall as usual on the penultimate syllable, as here, catalogo, or because of the unfamiliarity of the word, or in any other instance where a reader might fall into error. Over the past century, enormous strides have been made in English manuscript studies in assembling and describing the evidence for medieval book ownership. Chief among them, two complementary projects: Medieval Libraries of Great Britain, comprising lists of surviving manuscripts that contain evidence of their medieval institutional ownership, and the Corpus of British Medieval Library Catalogues, which provides editions of medieval lists of books from ecclesiastical and academic institutions. Last autumn, a pilot project was launched in Oxford under the leadership of Richard Sharp to begin to combine and supplement in searchable electronic form all the material from these two indispensable reference tools. Various other hand lists and catalogues have been compiled of books written or owned in England, most notably that of Helmut Neuss, in which he recorded all surviving books and fragments written or owned in England before 1100. It is one thing, however, to know which texts were available, when and where, and another to comprehend what use was made of those texts and their perceived significance in any given period. There's a danger that our own perceptions, which inform the way we study this evidence, may be shaped in part by anachronistic assumptions. Leonard Boyle's talk drew my attention to one such misapprehension that had influenced my own research on book production and book collections in England after the Norman Conquest. He showed that among the books that contain accents to aid public reading were a significant number of handsome late 11th and 12th century copies of the major works of the Church Fathers, such as Augustine's great commentary on the Psalms or Jerome's on Isaiah. These were volumes that I, like others, had previously considered as books read for personal study and devotion, and more importantly, as witnesses to the intellectual impact of the Norman Conquest, and as one aspect of the flourishing of intellectual life commonly referred to as the 12th century Renaissance. I was intrigued to learn more about the contexts within which such books would have been used for communal public reading, and what range of texts might have been involved. It's rare for studies of medieval scriptoria in libraries to examine books from this perspective, but one important exception is Nigel Palmer's study of the medieval books of the Cistercian Abbey of Eberbach. The practices that Professor Palmer outlines can be shown to correspond, broadly speaking, to those of other traditions of communal religious life by the 12th century. Communities of monks and regular canons listened to readings delivered aloud, not only during the liturgy of the Mass and the night office of Matins, but also during the daily meeting in the chapter house, the evening meeting in the chapter house or in Cistercian practice in the cloister, known as collation, at mealtimes in the refectory, and during periods of manual labour. Little or nothing is known about what was read during the last of these extra-liturgical occasions, but it is possible to establish fairly well-defined parameters for the readings delivered during each of the other three, and sometimes to identify manuscripts used for the purpose. The readings delivered during the chapter office and collation were taken from two fairly restricted groups of texts. In the case of the chapter office, the core ingredients were a portion of the rule or an analogous text, the relevant extract from the Martyrology, and on certain occasions a sermon. The reading at collation normally comprised texts, largely patristic or early medieval, that advocated or exemplified the monastic life and virtues, such as Cassian's Collations and Institutes, the collection of lives of the early Desert Fathers, known as the Vitas Patrum, Gregory's Dialogues, and Smaragdus's Diadema Monachorum, a patristic florilegium derived largely from Cassian and Gregory, compiled in the early 9th century, specifically as readings for collation. This diet only came to be broken at the major feasts, such as at Christmas and Easter, when homilies proper to the feast were read instead. The programme of reading in the Refectory, however, was far more extensive and complex. The surviving evidence is patchy, especially so for England before the late 13th century, and each individual source can be difficult to interpret in isolation. Scholarly literature on the subject is scattered in periodicals and other specialised studies, stretching back to the 1890s, but this has never been fully synthesised and is by no means easy to assemble and digest. Very little of it is in English. As a result, mention of refectory reading in studies of medieval books can be somewhat vague or betray an incomplete understanding of the practice. In particular, the reading in the refectory and the reading at collation are sometimes confused or conflated. So I hope that this lecture may provide some clarification. The practice of listening to sacred readings during mealtimes is advocated in several early texts on the communal life, most notably in chapter 38 of the Rule of St. Benedict. Reading will always accompany the meals of the brothers. The reader should not be the one who just happens to pick up the book, but someone who will read for a whole week, beginning on Sunday. Let there be complete silence, no whispering, no speaking, only the reader's voice should be heard there. Similar injunctions are found in other texts, such as Cassian's Institutes, and a text known as the Ordo Monasterii that was sometimes a constituent element of the rule attributed to St. Augustine. Monastic reformers continued to place emphasis upon the practice at the other end of the Middle Ages, as is reflected here in this late 15th century image accompanying a Dutch translation of the account of the origin and rules of the Carthusian order. Carthusians, of course, followed a semi-eremitical existence in private cells, but they met together for meals on Sundays and major feast days, and here you can see them seated at table while one of their number reads from a pulpit up above them at the top left. By at least the late 12th or early 13th centuries, pulpits were becoming an integral part of refectory rooms. Built into one wall of the refectory, approached by stairs which were either fronted by an open arcade, as here, in one of the best surviving, if somewhat restored, examples from Beaulieu Abbey, now used as the parish church, or the stairs were fully enclosed within the wall, as would have seemed to have been the case here at Tintern Abbey. Here you've got the entrance into the stairway, and you can just see the first of the stairs on the right of the entrance. The pulpit, unfortunately, no longer survives. Neither the Benedictine rule nor any other late antique text on the communal life prescribed which texts were to be read. And I've yet to locate any early medieval evidence for the content. I have yet to locate any early medieval evidence for the content of refectory reading, apart from the strictures of Alcuin, writing within a year or two of his arrival at Tours in the late 8th century, to a bishop he nicknamed Spiratus. It used to be thought that the bishop and community in question were Higbald and the monks of Lindisfarne, but Donald Bullough demonstrated that Alcuin's vocabulary indicates a secular community of clerics, not monks, and suggested that the recipient was more likely the Bishop of Leicester, or Nuona. In this famous passage, Alcuin admonishes the bishop, "Let God's words be read at the episcopal dinner table. It is right that a reader should be heard, not a harpist. Patristic discourse, not pagan song. What has Hiniel to do with Christ? Detailed evidence accumulates in the period between the early 11th and the early 13th centuries, becoming more plentiful from the later 13th. This evidence takes the form of prescriptions or recommendations for refectory reading, which are sometimes included in monastic customals and ordinals, medieval book lists that sometimes contain lists of books used in the refectory, or individual entries identifying the item in question as a refectory book, and finally, inscriptions and annotations in the manuscripts themselves. Several of the medieval lists of refectory reading and refectory books were brought together and published in an article in Review Benedictine by Donatella Nebii della Guarda. In this extremely helpful article, she combines evidence for both refectory and collation reading, summarising and briefly reflecting upon the texts recorded. She doesn't, however, go into the principles that underlie their selection and arrangement, or the essential differences between the readings at mealtimes and those at collation. One of these lists, a 13th century list from the Abbey of Bury St Edmunds, has caused particular confusion because a reference to the refectory in both its rubric and in an inscription in one of the volumes recorded in it that has survived has led to an assumption that it is a list of monastic refectory reading. And I've given the contents of the list at the start of the first page of the handout. The rubric, which I've translated here, states that the list is an annual, in fact a 3-yearly cycle of reading in the refectory at the meal times of the servants and at the collation of the monks. If one unpacks this rubric, it is clear that it is not a cycle of reading at the meal times of the monks, only that of the servants. The texts listed are in fact typical of those of other records of monastic reading at collation. And if we look at the one surviving volume from this list, an early 12th century copy of Pseudo Prosper on the active and contemplative life, copied incidentally in a distinctively Christchurch Canterbury hand, an inscription at the top of the opening page refers only to the monks reading at collation. A second inscription on the front end leaf does mention the refectory, but this must refer either to where the book was kept or to its use during the servants' meals. Now, although the surviving evidence is patchy and is sometimes not wholly transparent, it is possible, taking all the English and continental evidence together, to discern the emergence of annual cycles of reading in the refectory, different from the cycle of collation reading from Bury, and whose general parameters were shared by the various traditions of communal life, whether of monks or regular canons, throughout the Western Church. The effect, by at least the end of the 12th century, was a programme of reading that operated in dialogue with the liturgy and its calendar in various ways. First, it provided a means of fulfilling the prescriptions for the readings of the night office by completing in the refectory whatever, for reasons of time, could not be read within that office. Second, it allowed further reflection on the liturgical lessons of the office and the Mass by means of readings from patristic biblical commentary and gospel homilies. And third, it could be used to extend the observance of a saint's feast beyond the liturgy with additional readings from the lives, miracles, and translation of the saint. A full understanding of the precise nature of the relationship between refectory and office readings in individual houses is still some way off, not least because our current detailed knowledge of the night office readings, certainly before the late Middle Ages, is still very incomplete. Nevertheless, the general framework that structured both the office and refectory readings, and sometimes details of actual practice at the local level, are discernible. These are perhaps best outlined by breaking down the content of the night office readings into its principal components and examining the evidence for the use of each in the refectory. liturgical readings of the Night Office by the 11th century drew upon three principal components: an annual cycle of continuous reading of the books of the Bible, patristic homilies upon the Gospel Mass reading of the day, and thirdly, hagiographical texts appropriate to a given feast. On Sundays and major feasts, the readings were grouped into 3 nocturnes, each comprising a number of readings, 4 per nocturne in monastic practice and 3 in that of the seculars and regular canons. Although a certain degree of common practice underlay the cycle of readings, and is most evident in the biblical readings assigned, the surviving evidence also indicates a bewildering amount of variation in the choice of readings from house to house, even those from within the same monastic tradition. It's important to note that even the norms concerning the type of text read within each of the 3 nocturnes of the Night Office on Sundays and major feasts that are observable in late medieval breviaries and which are presented as medieval norms in modern handbooks and guides to the medieval liturgy, these norms had not yet become established by the Central Middle Ages. Advocates of the various movements of reform of the communal life between the 10th and the 12th centuries place special emphasis upon the biblical component. Surviving 11th and 12th century customals outline an annual cycle of continuous reading of the entire Bible, with the exception of the Psalter and the Gospels, which had their own cycles of liturgical reading. The biblical cycle was based upon cycles of continuous biblical reading drawn up in Rome during the 7th and 8th centuries, and which became more widely disseminated during the Carolingian ecclesiastical reforms of the late 8th and early 9th centuries. And the second item on the first page of the handout sets out the cycle known as Ordo Romanus 13a, versions of which constituted the cycle most commonly followed in England by the 12th century. As you can see, the sequence followed was not wholly that of the order of books found in complete Bibles, since certain books were taken out of sequence to be read at appropriate seasons within the liturgical year. Thus, the sequence of Old Testament books that began with Genesis at Septuagesima was interrupted on Passion Sunday by the reading of Jeremiah, then Lamentations, and followed in Easter week until Pentecost by those books of the New Testament that referred to the post-resurrection history of the Church: Acts, the 7 Catholic epistles, and the Apocalypse. Now, to carry out this cycle of reading in full was a tall order, and could lead to the Night Office becoming inordinately long. The solution was to permit a spillover into the reading in the Refectory. Our earliest evidence of this device comes from a passage at the end of the customs drawn up in the early 11th century for Aynsham Abbey by its first abbot, the homilist FRHistS. After setting out a cycle of biblical reading closely corresponding to Ordo Romanus 13a, he writes, "And be it known that in the course of the year the entire canon of Scripture ought to be read in church. But because we are lazy and slothful, we read in the Refectory whatever we do not cover in church." Now, FRHistS was almost certainly referring to a practice not uniquely devised for Aynsham, but one already adopted in other Reformed Benedictine houses in England and on the continent. Slightly more detailed evidence of how the spillover operated is found in the 3 early Cluniac customals, the mid-11th century Liber Traumatis and the late 11th century customs compiled by Bernard of Cluny and Ulrich of Zell. Ulrich is the most informative, explaining, for example, that whereas the book of Genesis was read in the Abbey Church at Cluny in its entirety during the Night Office in the week that began with Septuagesima, during the following week the reading of Exodus was split between the church and the Refectory. 12th century evidence suggests that some form of dovetailing of office and refectory reading of the Bible had become the norm not only in communities that followed the Benedictine rule, including Cistercians, but also those that followed the rule of Augustine. Indeed, the earliest surviving customol that sets out in full a scheme for biblical reading in the Refectory for the entire year, as far as I'm aware, is the Liber Ordinis of the Augustinian house of Saint-Victor in Paris. Sadly, the earliest surviving cycles of refectory reading from English religious houses that provide this level of detail are in sources that date from no earlier than the late 13th century. These comprise 3 late 13th century customols, 2 from Benedictine houses, Norwich Cathedral Priory and Peterborough Abbey, and you have the Peterborough Abbey list on the reverse of the handout, and 1 from the Augustinian Priory of Barnwell, near Cambridge. However, fortunately, other evidence survives of the practice of biblical reading in the Refectory in England at an earlier date, including copies of the Bibles that were used. Perhaps the best known evidence of a Refectory Bible comes from the life of St. Hugh of Lincoln, in which we are told that King Henry II promised to obtain a copy of the Old and New Testament for Hugh's newly founded Carthusian Priory of Witham. Henry had learned that the monks of Winchester Cathedral Priory had recently completed an especially fine Bible, suitably decorated, to be read during meals. Evidently, the cumbersome task of ferrying a heavy volume to and fro from the choir to the refectory and back each day had prompted the acquisition of a second large-format lectern Bible at Winchester. Henry pressed the Prior of Winchester to give him the book, and he did so. St. Hugh and his monks were delighted, especially, so the narrative goes, because of the elegance of the hand and the beauty of the book, but most of all because the care with which it had been corrected gave it a special quality. The Bible in question has survived and was identified by Walter Oakeshott in his monumental study, The Two Winchester Bibles, as the so-called Out Bible, now in the Bodleian Library, a somewhat more modestly illuminated pair of volumes than the more famous and slightly later Winchester Bible. Just how many of the magnificent large-format Bibles produced in England in the 12th century were made for use specifically in the Refectory is unfortunately difficult to establish, since none of the manuscripts contains explicit evidence concerning their use. Nevertheless, a 15th century benefaction list from Bury St Edmunds refers to the famous Bury Bible, seen here, as Biblia Refectorii. The magnificent late 11th century Bible donated to Durham Cathedral Priory by Bishop William of St Calais is recorded in a late 14th century list of refectory books at Durham. As with the Bury Bible, we cannot be certain that the Caroleff Bible was intended to be used in the refectory from the outset, although, as Leonard Boyle pointed out, the presence at the start of the first volume of a treatise on correct accentuation strongly suggests that it was used for public reading. This can also be inferred from the presence of accents to aid public reading in the Bury Bible. Here, the original scribe has spotted an error of word separation in the middle line, which would have also caused a reader to accentuate the syllables incorrectly. So, in addition to tracing a tie mark between what had been written as 2 words, inter AR, he has traced an accent over the second syllable to indicate the correct accentuation in terear. Other accents have been supplied subsequently, as for example at the end of the penultimate line here over the second syllable of Joseph. The Dover Bible was also evidently produced with the annual cycle of biblical reading in mind, since the first volume opens with a version of the Ordo Romanus 13a. Although again, whether it was used in the choir, the refectory, or both, must be established from other evidence. Use in the night office sometimes left traces in the books, in the form of series of Roman numerals in the margins, demarcating the passages to be read for each of the readings. These most commonly designate the sets of 3 readings read on ferial nights. But the refectory readings were not likely to prompt such markings. Their length never became standardised for the simple and practical reading that the time taken for meals was unpredictable. In the absence of explicit evidence, such as an inscription, it can therefore be difficult to prove that a Bible used in the office was also used in the refectory. Rare evidence of such dual use, however, does survive in a multi-volume 12th century Bible from Clairvaux, which not only has the ferial readings marked up, but also in a few places states where the mealtime reading was to begin in relation to what had been read in the night office. The Benedictine rule states that, quote, besides the inspired books of the Old and New Testaments, the works read at vigils, i.e. the night office, should include explanations of Scripture by reputable and orthodox Catholic fathers. This came to be fulfilled in 2 rather different ways, through readings from patristic gospel homilies corresponding to the cycle of gospel readings at Mass on Sundays and major feast days, and through readings taken from patristic commentary on Scripture corresponding with the annual cycle of biblical readings. And both types of text became integrated within the annual cycle of refectory readings. As far as gospel homilies are concerned, from the Carolingian period onwards, the readings for the final nocturne on many Sundays and great feast days throughout the year were taken from a patristic gospel homily. The practice is mentioned by FRHistS, who comments at the end of his outline of the cycle of biblical reading that whilst on the feasts of saints throughout the year, the office readings could be taken from the lives or passions of the saints, for the 3rd reading they should be, quote, from a homily on the gospel, as we do always and everywhere. By the time FRHistS wrote, most of these readings were taken from homilies in the Great Homiliary, compiled specifically for this purpose at Charlemagne's request by Paul the Deacon. Nearly all the surviving lists of refectory reading from England and the continent integrate within the annual cycle readings from this homiliary and from other patristic gospel homilies, specifying their use on Sundays and at the major festivals such as Christmas, Epiphany, Easter, etc. Homilies set aside for use in the refectory are recorded in the late 12th century book lists of Reading Abbey and its daughter house at Leinster, and in 14th century lists from Durham. Scholars have long recognised the importance of such homiliaries for the reception of patristic exegesis and theology in the early and central Middle Ages. But in some instances, monks went directly to copies of the full patristic texts themselves. For example, several of the lists of refectory reading recommend that in weekdays during Lent, and in addition to or as an alternative to the allotted biblical reading, Augustine's homilies on the Gospel of St. John might be read. In some of these lists, the text is referred to as De Cana Domini, a title that signified just the second part of Augustine's commentary, focusing upon the Passion narrative. And in such cases, the text was read through sequentially. In other houses, the text was read only on those many days in Lent when the Gospel at Mass was taken from John, thus tying the refectory readings more closely to the liturgy of the day. Since these Gospel readings do not follow the sequence of John's Gospel, but dot about, Augustine's commentary was likewise not read in sequence. The reader in the refectory therefore needed some guidance as to which homily should be read on which day, and this need has left a visible mark in several 12th century copies in the form of marginal headings specifying the particular day and week in Lent when that passage was to be read. Here, in a copy of unknown English origin and provenance, we see at the start of Augustine's homily, commenting on the beginning of John chapter 7, a contemporary marginal heading on the left that states Feria 3, 5th week of Lent, on which day the Gospel reading was indeed John chapter 7, beginning at verse 1. A copy from Glastonbury not only contains such marginal headings, but also an explanatory note for the Lector Refectory at the start of the volume. In order to observe the Feast of Trinity Sunday in the Refectory, monastic communities turned not to patristic gospel homilies, but to treatises on the doctrine of the Trinity. The monks of Norwich and of Reading took their patristic doctrine neat in the form of Augustine's De Trinitate, or additionally, in the case of Reading, the De Trinitate of Hilary. But the monks of Peterborough, as you can see from the cycle of refectory reading in your handout, imbibed this patristic teaching in a more accessible form via Alcuin's treatise on the Trinity. The second type of use of patristic commentary also usually involved recourse to copies of the full texts of patristic commentaries, read sequentially and corresponding to the annual cycle of biblical reading. In the cycle of refectory reading from Peterborough, for example, in the weeks after Easter, the biblical books of Acts, the 7 Catholic epistles and the Apocalypse were followed, if time permitted, by Bede's commentary on Acts and the Catholic epistles, Berengauda's on the Apocalypse, and Augustine's commentary on the Epistle of John. The various cycles of refectory reading from England and the continent display a mixture of common practice and local differences in the particular commentaries specified. While at Peterborough, the reading of the book of Isaiah in December was complemented by Jerome's commentary, the Augustinian Canons of St. Victor in Paris listened to Origen, and the monks of Bury to the commentary of the Carolingian Hamo of Auxerre. Unfortunately, the actual manuscripts that were used can be hard to identify because, as with the reading of the Bible, such continuous reading of the text didn't leave its own traces, and inscriptions labelling the books for refectory use are rare. Just a couple survive from Bury St Edmunds, a copy of Gregory's commentary on Ezekiel, and Hamo's commentary on Isaiah. Both contain inscriptions reading De Refectorio Monacorum Sancti Edmundi. 2 books survive from Peterborough that contain texts listed in that abbey's cycle of refectory reading. 12th century copies of the commentaries of Bede on the Catholic epistles and Berengauda's on the Apocalypse, both now at Corpus Christi College, Cambridge. Neither now contains any inscription, although the copy of Bede may once have done. According to M.R. James, who catalogued the Corpus manuscripts, an erased inscription on the first page of text could be made out to read Liber Refectorii Burg. Now, it's impossible to see the mere traces of such an inscription today, even under ultraviolet light, but in gloomy natural light, a stain of what may have been a reagent used by James is just visible in the left-hand side of the upper margin. And with the eye of faith, one might even make out the odd letter that would correspond to that inscription. There is very clearly a stain there. But whether the reagents that we used produced an effect, which means that the reagent often isn't visible in natural light, I don't know, and I welcome advice on this. Well, in fact, the book does contain still visible evidence of its use in the refectory. This takes the form of marginal annotations specifying the few days when, exceptionally, the text was read out of sequence to correspond with the epistle of the Mass on those days. Just as with the copy of Augustine's homilies on John's Gospel that I showed you earlier, here is a marginal heading specifying the 5th Sunday after Pentecost, when the introit at Mass was Exaudi Domine. component of the night office readings, in all but the more austere of monastic traditions, was hagiography. In some monastic houses, all 12 lessons could come from a saint's life. In others, as FRHistS prescribed, just the first 8, with the final 4 lessons being taken from the Gospel homily. The extent to which such hagiography was read in the Refectory appears to have differed from house to house. The Liber Ordinis of the Augustinians of Saint Victor in Paris simply includes the general provision that, quote, on saints' feasts their lives and passions may be read. Lists of refectory reading from the northern French monasteries of Fécamp, Marchiennes and Saint-Vaast-Arras itemise a considerable number of days throughout the year on which a saint's feast could be observed in such a way. The Peterborough list, however, only makes provision for the reading of saints' lives in the periods from Septuagesima to Passion Sunday, from Ascension to Pentecost, and from Advent to Epiphany. Whether the intention really was to ensure that the biblical reading was completed during the period from Pentecost to the beginning of Advent, or whether the list is not wholly comprehensive with regard to the observance of saints' feasts, is unclear. By the later 11th and 12th centuries, massive compilations of saints' lives in 2 or more volumes, arranged in the order of the liturgical year, were becoming widespread. The occasional presence of numbered lections shows that these legendaries were sometimes used in the office, but the inclusion of the lives of numerous saints that did not form part of the local observance of the individual houses that owned the volumes has led Guy Philippard and others to argue that office use was not the primary function of these great tomes, but rather that the principal place where they were read aloud was in the refectory, where it is clear from other evidence that it was permissible to observe not only the feast of a saint from the local calendar, but that of another saint familiar to the community from the passage read from the Martyrology during the chapter of this. The earliest surviving legendary from England is a pair of volumes from Worcester Cathedral Priory, dating from the mid-11th century, now divided between the British Library and Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, and for this reason commonly referred to as the Cotton Corpus Legendary. The volumes contain evidence of their use for public reading from very shortly after they were produced. As in this slide, the Old English words, and here forgive my pronunciation, offerheth and for, were supplied as tiny interlinear annotations, directing the reader to stop and then to resume, omitting the passage in between. In some instances, these and similar annotations are found in the lives of saints included in Worcester's liturgical calendar, which is indeed included at the beginning of the first volume. But in one instance, they were added to the life of St. Trudeau, whose feast was not observed there. From this, we may perhaps infer that this life was read in the refectory on St. Trudeau's feast day, the 23rd of November, while the feast of St. Clement, recorded for that day in the calendar at the start of the volume, was observed liturgically. For the commemoration of local saints not included in the legendary, a community would have recourse to smaller volumes of saints' lives. For example, in an early 12th century copy of the Lives of Canterbury Saints, composed for the Abbey of St. Augustine's by Gosselin of Saint-Bertin, the text of his Historia Maior Sancti Augustini is accompanied by a note instructing that the text be read in the refectory on the feast of St. Augustine. Responsibility for the day-to-day choice of refectory reading within the broad parameters I've outlined lay with the Cantor. He saw to the provision of the books involved and to their correction, and he also rehearsed the reader for the week and himself acted as reader at the major feasts of Christmas, Easter and Pentecost. The number and range of volumes involved was considerable. Not just the Bible, homiliary and legendary, but several other volumes of saints' lives, and a significant number of patristic commentaries and other works that we usually think of as library books. A cumulative list compiled from English customals and book lists includes Augustine's commentaries on the Psalms, the Gospel of John and the Epistle of John and his De Trinitate, Jerome's commentary on Isaiah, Ambrose's De Fide and commentary on Psalm 118, Gregory's commentaries on Ezekiel and on Job, Bede's on Acts and the Catholic epistles, the histories of Josephus, Eusebius and Cassiodorus, Didymus on the Holy Spirit and Hilary on the Trinity, together with some later Carolingian commentaries. If we add to this list the patristic and later texts read at collation, then we have quite a significant proportion of the texts produced or acquired during that remarkable period of book production within religious communities in England and on the continent between the late 11th and late 12th centuries. This was the period when it was the norm for the cantor also to be the monastic armarius or librarian. His oversight of the public reading outside the choir, as well as of the chant and readings within it, perhaps explains more satisfactorily why his custodianship of the monastic books extended beyond those volumes we would describe as liturgical to encompass the entire library. The size and quality of the volumes involved indicates the importance of such public reading within monastic communities, as does the emphasis placed upon the choice of reader and upon correct pronunciation in the rule and later customals. Some customals enjoyed the abbot or prior who presided at mealtimes to stop the reader if he made a mistake and make him repeat the sentence correctly. For those monks sufficiently Latinate and attentive to absorb the substance of the readings, the impact upon their knowledge and reception of these texts, heard year after year, must have been considerable. I would like to end with an anecdote that adds a further mid-12th century monastic perspective. The anecdote assumes the audience's appreciation of the importance of the mealtime reading and the care with which the reading was to be delivered, but uses the practice to exemplify a still greater monastic virtue. The anecdote comes from the anonymous life of Lanfranc, Archbishop of Canterbury, and concerns the period shortly after his arrival as a monk at the Norman Abbey of Bec, when he was merely the grammar master. Despite the rapid fame that Lanfranc acquired as a teacher, the life emphasises the importance to Lanfranc of monastic humility. Expert Latinist though he was, he still took pains to rehearse the readings with the cantor whenever it was his turn to be the weekly reader in the refectory. One day, as he was reading, he pronounced a certain word, docere, correctly, with a stress upon the second syllable. The prior, however, who was not literatus, stopped him and wrongly asserted that the correct pronunciation was docere. Lanfranc, mindful of the rule's teaching concerning the first step to humility, did not demur, but repeated the word incorrectly with a stress on the first syllable. For he recognised that obedience to Christ in the form of his superior was more important than obedience to the grammatical rules of Donatus. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have been feasted as is appropriate. We could spend several hours questioning Professor Weber. We have hopes of seeing this in print because we will all need to rely on it. Those of you who saw 2 Sundays ago David Dimbleby turning the pages of the very Bible will feel that paleography could find no finer vindication
that it has had this evening. We have all seen the very Bible, if only on the television. We have all believed we knew how the very Bible was to be read. We have heard, thanks to the achievement of Dr. Webber, quite how complicated monastic reading is, and how the practice of rumination, both of food and of text, imprints on the hearer what he, she will rely on in their life. But we have done better than we would have done in reading Tessa Webber's lecture. We have heard it, and we have been reminded that it is the living presence of the voice pronouncing correctly, which breathes into our activities. Can I ask you again, before we reward all of you and Tessa herself with that mixtum which the reader in the Refectory rightfully deserves, if only as a mouthwash, can I ask you to join me in thanking Tessa for reminding us precisely in these dark times what the love of learning entails.